Greetings, this is Jim Hynes speaking, and you're watching the beginning of the Newman Parish Lent course. Friar Tim had asked me to do 3 of these on these 3 topics. First of all, why God? That's what we're going to be speaking about today. The second one, which I'll be recording soon, is why Jesus for me? And the third one, which we'll be doing about 2 weeks from now, towards the end of March, will be why the Trinity for me? Now, of course, the original plan was to meet in person, but the coronavirus has driven us all into hiding. So also, when we did the first session on why God, the attendance was not that good, so we thought we'd start by recording that one and publishing it on the parish website, and then recording the second and the third. So a little about me, first of all. As they say in North Carolina, you all ain't from around here, is you? Well, the answer is no. I was born in England, the city of Hull in the northeast, which is a coastal fishing port. I lived in many other places. I became a priest in the Archdiocese of Westminster for 12 years, left the priesthood, crossed the ocean to make my fortune, became an employee of St Thomas Parish for many years. I was director of elementary faith formation for many years, also later adult formation and catechumenate. So now I'm an independent theologian, spiritual director, and generally speaking, I hope a useful person. So again, Friar Tim asked me to address these topics, and what I'm planning to do with Why God is, first of all, to dig into a little bit of philosophy, and then to look at different ways of thinking also from science about if that helps or hinders us to learn about God. St Thomas Aquinas had 5 ways of demonstrating the existence of God, which are part of classical Catholic philosophy, so I'm going to be looking into those as well. He also asked me to have some kind of an answer for the modern atheists, so I'm going to try to do that with a little help from Bishop Robert Barron, but also a little help from Chapel Hill's most famous atheist. I won't tell you yet who that is, so you can have a little fun guessing before we reveal this person's name. I'm also going to be looking at the scriptures, many of the scriptures during this season of Lent. I'm saying if it's a Lent course, we ought to be paying attention to the scripture as we make our way to Holy Week and Easter. So I'll be using quite a lot of scripture later in this session, and certainly throughout the whole of the 3 parts. But in fact, there's going to be a 4th part after Easter on the resurrection, but we'll leave that aside for now. So, why God? Where do we begin with this? And it is not only, as it were, in a philosophical sense, trying to show that God exists, but why this is important. Why this could be important, certainly for us as Catholics, but for any human being, indeed any creature in the universe. Where do we begin? I suggest we start with the reality and the experience of our own existence and awareness. And I believe that if we pay close attention to these, we will begin to learn about God as creator. One reason to start here is that it is a starting point that really anyone can accept, because one thing that we are aware of is that we are aware. You may know of the philosopher René Descartes, who started saying, I think, therefore I am. So my starting point is somewhat similar to his, but I'm not going to go in quite the same direction. I'm going to start then with what do we see, what do we notice, what do we experience, what do we ask or seek, or for that matter, what do we avoid? So let's think about our awareness. We don't immediately know where it comes from, but it is immediate and obvious to us. We are aware of things outside us, things that we perceive, but we are also aware of ourselves, with bodies, feelings, thoughts, perceptions, desires, and aversions. So, in a sense, we perceive ourselves and I as center of awareness and perception. So what next? We are aware of things which persist, like ourselves or our furniture. We are also aware of things which change, such as, again, ourselves or the weather or living things. We observe things which do not seem to be alive, which change very little, such as rocks. Things which are alive, which don't do very much, such as plants. I hope I'm not offending any botanists watching, because yes, I know plants are very exciting, but let's be honest, they don't do a great deal other than grow. There are also things that move around and seem to have not only life, but also some consciousness and purpose, such as animals. And then also there are other bodies like ours. And by all appearances and perceptions, they have purposes and a capacity to communicate very much like our own. So we know we are not alone, but we inhabit a world full of beings that we can begin to understand and even to communicate with. So far, so good. So in saying all these things, we realize one more thing, and that is kind of obvious, but also important. The world we live in is intelligible to us. So this tells us at least three things. The first one is there is a regularity and predictability in the world, some combination of trustworthy stability and predictable change. The second thing is we must have the capacity to grasp and to rely upon and to orient ourselves by this intelligibility in the world. Something very important in us correlates to something very important in the world that we are aware of. Now, where did that come from? It gives me confidence to act in the world, because the intelligence I have can make sense of and grasp and navigate the intelligibility that I see. And the third thing is, other people also seem to have this intelligent capacity to deal with the world. We observe other people and their conduct that, at least most of the time, expresses intelligibility and intelligence. In fact, I can intelligibly communicate with them about each other and the world that we see. One may also add that here we are in a university town, and the whole presumption of the university life is intelligibility and communication and reason. So I can ask then, where does this intelligibility in the world come from? And with it, my perceptions, which can grasp and respond to that intelligibility and find the world a trustworthy place to maneuver. Well, as they say on Sesame Street, one of these things is kind of like the other. Two of these things are kind of the same. Is this connection just there in the world? Does it come from somewhere else, or someone, or something? One thing I can say is that wherever it comes from, it's kind of friendly and also trustworthy, because I find that I can rely upon the world unfolding in a predictable way without being tricky or arbitrary. So it means I can get out of bed in the morning tomorrow and plan my day. So it appears that something both friendly and trustworthy has organized the world, excuse me, and my place in it, and my trustworthy perceptions of it and of other people too. Great. So let's think now about how things seem to work and why. Things have shapes and forms and substance which make them what they are. People have purposes and aims and reasons that they do things. People can act upon things by various processes to change them into other things. So let's take the classic example, beloved, of philosophers, a table. Imagine our carpenter, who we will call Josephine, who sets about making a table. We ask her why, and she says, "This is how I make my living. then I can sell it and buy other things I want. So she has a purpose in making the table. Well, how did she make it? Using wood and tools and glue to a pattern or a shape that she has in mind, not using coal or pizza or water, because a successful table must have a certain form and substance. We can say then of the finished table that Josephine made it. And also at this point, I'd like to bring into the discussion St Thomas Aquinas, our favorite Catholic philosopher, to comment on the process. So we will ask Thomas the very simple philosophical question: what caused this table to come into being? So Thomas would say that at least 4 distinct types of causes are at work. At this point, we get into some scholastic philosophical language, but please bear with me because I think this can help us on our journey. First of all, Thomas Aquinas will discuss what he calls the efficient cause. That is to say, what mechanical processes have been at work. So from a certain point of view, really, this is all that's happened. Josephine has selected the wood, measured it, cut, planed, drilled, turned, glued, and finished it using various tools. So this is the perspective of the physical sciences, which is very good at dealing with materials and processes and mechanical things. So a second type of cause is also operating, which St. Thomas would call the formal cause. Now, a formal cause doesn't mean that you have to put on your best suit and tie, but rather it's the cause which gives something its form, or you might say its shape or design. This includes the physical properties of the wood and the design of the carpenter. This is what gives the table its tableness. The third one is what he would call the final cause or teleological cause. So this involves some long Latin or Greek words. When we call it final, it's from the Latin word finis, meaning the goal or the end. So in other words, this is the purpose of making the table. Tables just don't assemble themselves, not even from IKEA, but rather there is a purpose in somebody creating a table, in the mind and the heart of the builder, to make something beautiful or useful, or to make a living, or for some other reason. So this cause is not a physical property, and nor is it a mechanical process, but rather it exists in the will and the desire of the carpenter. So it's something very different than the kind of mechanical causes that scientists look at. So the fourth one, according to our lovely philosopher Thomas, is the existential cause. So we notice that as well as the design, the willing, and the mechanics, we also know that the table exists. So one can imagine a table that doesn't exist, but you cannot make a non-existent table. So Josephine provided the design and the mechanics because she had a purpose, but she did not provide the existence of the table, nor any of its pre-existing components, nor even did she provide her own existence as the table maker. So all of these things are contingent, that is, depending for existence on something outside of and prior to itself. But what shall we call this? Just existence, or existence that's not contingent, or existence which exists of itself? Now, this last term, in fact, this self-existing existence, is what St. Thomas Aquinas understands as God. In fact, in a way, that's his definition of God, that which exists of itself, distinguishing it, of course, from every other thing which exists, which he would call a creature. In other words, that means something created, which exists because God gives it existence. So we've just looked at what it means to make one thing, but what about making the whole universe, or as we might say also, creation? So we return again to St Thomas Aquinas, and he has 5 ways of demonstrating the existence of God. And we'll look at each of these in a moment. Now, if you're not familiar with St Thomas Aquinas, here's a little bit about him. He developed a theological system that synthesized Western Christian theology and the philosophy of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle lived about 3 centuries BC. And particularly, one of their most helpful sources for Aquinas was actually some Islamic commentators. And what had happened was a lot of the Greek philosophy had been translated into Arabic and used by Muslim philosophers for some centuries. And then eventually in Spain, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked together quite happily in about the 12th century or so, Aquinas became aware of the work of Aristotle. And then what he did is he brought these 2 things together. And his most famous writing was called the Summa Theologica, was meant as a primer for theology students. And he was very systematic, very thorough. And he also devised then 5 arguments for the existence of God, known as the 5 ways. And these subsequently proved very influential in the history of philosophy. So the first of Aquinas' 3 arguments, from motion, from causation, and from contingency, are types of what is called the cosmological argument for divine existence. So each begins with a general truth about natural phenomena and then proceeds to the existence of an ultimate creative source of the universe. In each case, Aquinas identifies this source with God. The first of Aquinas' 5 ways for demonstrating God's existence is the argument from motion. He drew from Aristotle's observation that each thing in the universe that moves is moved by something else. Aristotle reasoned that the series of movers must have begun with a first or prime mover that had not itself been moved or acted upon by any other agent. Aquinas understood this prime mover as God. The second of the 5 ways is the argument from causation, similar to the argument from movement. It builds upon Aristotle's notion of an efficient cause. That is, the entity or event responsible for a change in a particular thing. Because every efficient cause must itself have an efficient cause, and because there cannot be an infinite chain of efficient causes, there must be an immutable first cause of all the changes that occur in the world, and this first cause is God. Aquinas' 3rd demonstration for God's existence is the argument from contingency, which means distinguishing between possible and necessary beings. Possible beings are those that are capable of existing or not existing. So there must be at least one necessary being, one that is not capable of not existing, and this will be God. Aquinas' 4th argument is from degrees of perfection. All things exhibit a greater or lesser degree of perfection. There must therefore exist a supreme perfection that all imperfect beings approach yet fall short of. In Aquinas' system, of course, God is that paramount perfection. We will come back to this line of argument a little while later when we consider the mysterious Chapel Hill atheist I alluded to a little earlier. Aquinas' 5th and final way to demonstrate God's existence is an argument from final causes or ends in nature. Now, again, he drew upon Aristotle, who held that each thing has its own natural purpose or end. So Some things, however, such as natural bodies, don't have intelligence and are therefore incapable of directing themselves towards their ends. Now, human beings and animals have some degree of choice and initiative in doing that. So therefore, he said, they must be guided by some intelligent and knowledgeable being, which is God. So now we come to solve the mystery, not of God's existence, but of the infamous Chapel Hill atheist. You may know the name Bart Ehrman. He's a professor of religious studies here at the University of North Carolina. And he says of himself that for about 15 years, he's been both an agnostic, which means I don't know if there is a God, and an atheist, which means I don't believe that there is a God. So in fact, Bart Ehrman has a blog he writes on quite often, and he wrote only on January the 12th of this year, something which opened up the very slightest possibility that God might exist, making, in fact, a similar statement to Aquinas' fourth argument about degrees of perfection. Bart Ehrman said that just as a rock cannot imagine that a dandelion exists, nor a dandelion imagine that a panther exists, likewise there may be superior beings which human beings might not be able to imagine, which is still there. So this is what he said. I had a revelatory moment last week that I think may have changed my view about God for a very long time, or at least about the existence of superior beings far beyond anything we can imagine. We simply can't know that there is a God in the same way that we know other things. And I myself long ago came to the point where I had to admit I really don't know. It's not that I deeply believe there is a God, but admit that technically I can't know. I mean, I really can't know. Over the past 15 years or so, I've also been calling myself an atheist, but I've always meant something different by that than from what many other people mean. Usually people think of an atheist as a more extreme agnostic, someone who doesn't say, I do not know if there is a God, but who says definitively, I know there is not a God. I never meant that. How could I know that either? I've taken agnosticism to refer to what you know, and atheism to refer to what you believe. Do I believe in God? No, I do not. So I'm an agnostic and an atheist at the same time. However, my revelatory moment has softened my view. I guess I'm still an agnostic and an atheist, but I still say I really don't know, and this is why. I have a meditation practice and over the past year or so, I've spent a lot of time meditating on consciousness, especially the marvel that I'm a self-conscious being. But something did occur to me the other day during the meditation that came as a revelation. So in our way of thinking, there are different orders of existence or being, an infinity of things that could exist but do not exist. Either they never did exist, or they once existed and don't any longer. Then there's most of the things that do exist we would call inanimate, such as minerals and stars and so on. And then there are many things that do exist and are animate that we would classify as non-animal, such as bacteria or plants, grass and oak trees and so on. Then a smaller group, again, of animals. They can move themselves, they differ on the cellular level and so on. Some of these animals also have brains and have instincts and some ability to assert a will and so on. And then we know of humans who, in our way of thinking, are at the top of the chain. We know of other animals which have some intelligence, but usually we conceptualize the humans with the ability, in fact, to conceptualize and to reflect on the past and the future in systematic ways and so on. So here is my duh moment. A rock has no way of recognizing that an animate object such as a dandelion exists. And a dandelion has no way of recognizing that a panther exists. Now it gets a little tricky because a panther has no way of recognizing that a superior intelligence exists, although a panther does recognize there are some other animals that it's best to avoid. There's no way of realizing that there are people, this is the panther, for example, who cannot imagine people who engineer skyscrapers or split atoms or reconstruct the history of ancient Rome. It's simply not in their purview. So humans can and do recognize and study these other forms of life. We can understand these things because in some sense our cognitive abilities are superior. But here's my point. The fact is that the lower ones can never know about the higher ones, what they really are, what they're capable of, how they exist, what they do, and so on. So why the blazes should I think that I can possibly know if there was a higher order of beings above me, superior to me in ways I simply cannot imagine? And not maybe just one order above me, but maybe several, all above each other, all superior to me in ways I cannot imagine. And if there are such orders, I would really have no way of knowing, literally. Duh. So I'm obviously not urging a return to traditional religion, says Bart Ehrman. I'm just saying there's a possibility there might be orders of existence higher than I am. And now that strikes me as completely plausible. Well, why not? Who says that I can figure it all out? If superior forms of intelligence and will do exist, I would literally have no way of knowing. And how many different forms or levels could there be? God knows, so to speak. So there we are. We see Chapel Hill's most famous atheist is actually probably unknown to himself, beginning to grasp and to wrestle with Thomas Aquinas' fourth method of proving the existence of God, or at least the possibility of the existence of God. So Ehrman is a great scholar, and I've read many of his books, and I really enjoy them, and he's an excellent historian of early Christianity. Doesn't believe in God, but he's very good at what he does. So in some ways, he is an example of a modern scholar who exhibits what sometimes can be called scientism, which is a kind of fundamentalism every bit as much of a fundamentalism as biblical fundamentalism. And for this, I will tell you I'm drawing from some writings by Bishop Robert Barron, who engages a great deal in these questions. So when he talks about scientism, he means the reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. And this is a point of view that, in fact, you might hear every day, at least implicitly, here at the university. The trouble is with this point of view is that in some way it is self-contradicting. So if you ask, where did you get that point of view? Where did you get that principle? And someone says, well, all true knowledge is open to the scientist, but that answer is not a scientific claim. There's no sort of experiment that you can do to prove that that is so. So really, it's a metaphysical or a philosophical sort of claim. The claim to believe or trust in science is not a scientific claim. But science itself, of course, depends upon certain presuppositions. For example, the intelligibility of the world, the principle of causality, which we explored a little earlier. So every scientist has to assume that, but there's no experiment that showed you that this is true. But rather, all experiments are based on that assumption. So in a certain sense, all scientists are sitting on a chair, but they're not looking at the chair and what the chair is standing upon. They're just assuming that there it is, it's stable, it's reliable, and it's trustworthy. So in fact, what they may not be aware of is that this is an assumption that comes from theology. It comes from a sense of a creator God who is intelligent, who makes all things with intelligibility, and also gives intelligence to human beings who can begin to understand and grasp that intelligibility, that causation, that systematic set of causes, and so on. Also, often atheists understand poorly what God is like. They have what we theologians and spiritual directors may call a poor image of God. So, for example, they may argue that, well, at one time we didn't understand thunder and lightning. We thought it was God banging his hammer, something like Thor. But now, of course, we do understand thunder and lightning, so we don't need to posit Thor as the one who makes all the noise and flashing. So in other words, this is a strategy often used by both sides of the argument, the religious people as well as the scientists. We call the God of the gaps. As science moves forward and fills in the gaps, for example, in things like cellular biology or subatomic physics, not to mention mathematics, God's realm seems to get smaller and smaller. If God doesn't have angels shoving the planets around in the sky, but they move around thanks to gravity, then we need not posit that God's moving them as an efficient cause, but rather that gravity is doing the work. So this is an example of confusing efficient cause, namely what shoves and pushes things, with existential cause, which is what holds them in existence or brings them into existence. So when you're looking for God, you're looking for the cause of everything, of every being in the universe. You're not just looking for one more being or one more big contingent cause. So you're asking, why is there something rather than nothing? Which is really not a scientific question, but a philosophical or theological question. So this ends the rather long part one of my reflections, more philosophical. And now we're going to have a bit of a change of tone. And having looked a little at philosophy, we're now going to turn to a different source of knowledge, namely biblical revelation. So as I said, I've been asked to present a Lent course. So I'm going to be drawing heavily upon the scriptures that we either have heard or will hear on Sundays during the season of Lent. And there is a handout which accompanies this talk which has those scriptures. But for now, I think I'll just read them for you as we go along. So I wanted to start with an Old Testament reading from the second Sunday of Lent, which is from the book of Genesis, chapter 12. The Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from the land of your kinsfolk and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. All the communities of the earth shall find blessing in you." Abram went as the Lord directed him. In case you're wondering who Abram is, his name was later changed to Abraham, and that's how we remember him. So I'd like just to pause for a moment and to ask you this. What did God ask of Abraham? And likewise, what does God ask of us? And also, what does God first offer to Abraham, and what does God offer to us? So what I'm suggesting is, if we go and look at the long story of Abraham in the book of Genesis and the issues which are dealt with there, God is offering Abraham a covenant, but God is also asking Abraham to avoid idolatry, that is, to avoid worshipping some other gods. Now, Abraham is a remarkable figure, and he's revered by the three great monotheistic religions as a founding figure: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He and his wife Sarah left behind the people they grew up with and their idolatrous and polytheistic practice. That means many gods rather than one God. So Abraham and Sarah were called to go in search of one God who is living and true, and with whom they could have a real relationship. So they were called to strictly worship one God alone, and, as I said, to avoid idolatry. So what is idolatry, and why is it something to be avoided? I want to leave this question slightly to one side for a little while and return to the second of our readings, which is the Ten Commandments taken from Deuteronomy. There's a different version of the Ten Commandments in the book of Exodus. They're broadly similar, but I choose the Deuteronomy version. Now, this is familiar, but it's also kind of long. Usually when we read or use the Ten Commandments, we have an abbreviated version for simplicity's sake. But each of the commandments has, several of the commandments have a lengthy kind of commentary built in, which is actually important to our purposes today. So from Deuteronomy chapter 5, first commandment, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall not have other gods beside me. You shall not make for yourself an idol or a likeness of anything that is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters beneath the earth. You shall not bow down before them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, bringing punishment for their parents' wickedness on the children of those who hate me, down to the third and fourth generation, but showing love down to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. The second commandment, you shall not invoke the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave unpunished anyone who invokes his name in vain. Third commandment, observe the Sabbath day. Keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath for the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, either you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or donkey or any work animal, or the resident alien within your gates, so that your male and female slaves may rest as you do. Remember that you too were once slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Fourth commandment, honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may have a long life and that you may prosper in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Fifth commandment, you shall not kill. Sixth commandment, you shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal, was the seventh commandment. The eighth commandment, you shall not bear dishonest witness against your neighbor. The ninth commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. The 10th commandment, you shall not desire your neighbor's house or field, his male or female slave, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So, a familiar text probably. How is it helpful to our discussion today? And why do I want to look at the Ten Commandments as part of this discussion? My reason is the Ten Commandments shows very clearly both what God offers to us and what God asks of us. At first glance, and the usual way we think about the Ten Commandments, they're about what does God forbid? And some of this may seem to be restrictive and to take away a lot of our fun. But there's more to it than this, and the Ten Commandments are actually built upon an understanding of covenant, both between God and human beings, and also between human beings and each other. So first, the commandments are about how we treat people, to show that God is giving human beings an environment of safety, dignity, and integrity. So God is saying to us, implicitly in all these commandments, what I ask of you is not to harm each other, not to exploit each other, but to treat each other well. God also offers the human beings the possibility of a relationship based upon trust. So we can trust that others will not harm us because we have a mutual agreement not to harm each other, which is ratified by our common faith in God. So the second aspect of the commandments, those early few commandments, are those commandments against idolatry, in which God is saying, put your trust in me alone and not in any partial or fragmentary beings or ideas or values, because in fact this limits and diminishes you. So we look a bit at this a little later, and why in fact the prohibition of idolatry is one of the best protections for human well-being and human rights as well. That is not intuitive, but I think it is certainly very true. So this is the language one often hears throughout the Old Testament scriptures, as God speaks about this covenant. I will be your God, and you will be my people. Now, the third thing I want to look at here is, in fact, the last of the two commandments about not coveting your neighbor's wife or goods. So this is where, in fact, I want to backtrack a little bit to the story of the fall, to Adam and Eve meeting the serpent from Genesis chapter 2. And then the reason I'm doing this is to look at this idea of of covetousness, of coveting your neighbor's wife or goods, and that this desire gone wrong is one of the major problems, I would suggest, in human life. And the Ten Commandments recognizes this, so too does the story of the fall. So this next reading comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. And in fact, it was the reading on the first Sunday of Lent. So again, I'm using the Lenten readings to illustrate our discussion. Now, the snake was the most cunning of all the wild animals that the Lord God had made. He asked the woman, did God really say that you shall not eat from any of the trees in the garden? The woman answered the snake, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. It's only about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, you shall not eat of it or even touch it, or else you will die. But the snake said to the woman, you certainly will not die. God knows very well that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like gods who know good from evil. The woman saw that the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eyes, and the tree was desirable for gaining wisdom. So she ate it. Then she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. When they heard the sound of the Lord God walking about in the garden at the breezy time of the day, the man and his wife hid themselves from the Lord among the trees of the garden. The Lord God then called to the man and said to him, where are you? He answered, I heard you in the garden, but I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. Then God asked, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree which I forbidden you to eat? The man replied, the woman who you gave me, she gave me the fruit of the tree, so I ate it. The Lord God then asked the woman, what is this that you have done? The woman answered, the snake tricked me, so I ate it. So listening to that story once again, I think it's actually meant to be read or even played out with a little bit of fun, because in some ways it is quite an absurd comedy. So there are some insights in there which we may miss unless they're pointed out. Now, in the last several years, I have read a lot of a philosopher called René Girard, who was a Frenchman who in fact taught at Duke University one time, but was best known for his work in Stanford. He was a scholar of ancient mythology, and he noticed that in a lot of ancient mythology, there were several patterns which repeated. One of them is that there was often a lot of violence, and sometimes the violence was visible. Sometimes it looked like it had been kind of cleaned up and hidden. He also noticed that often in a community when there was a lot of strife, the way the community responded is often by picking on one person and blaming them, pointing the finger at them, expelling and sometimes killing, murdering that person. And then often they felt happy, at least for a while, that they could say, that person is causing the trouble. If we get rid of them, we'll be happy and content again. Usually it worked, at least for a while, until the rivalry and tension arose again, and they had to find, again, somebody else to blame and to scapegoat and to cast out. So René Girard called this the scapegoating mechanism. Another thing that he noticed in connection with this, he said that desire is usually triangular. In other words, we don't necessarily desire something because we like it, but we desire it because somebody else does, and that desire is kind of infectious. So one everyday example is, what if you have two little children with a bunch of toys around? There could be, say, 20 different toys and two little toddlers, and one of them picks up a truck, and all of a sudden the other kid wants exactly the same truck. Now there could be 20 other things lying around, but what he will be drawn to and often start a fight over is the truck. Why? Because the other one has it. In other words, it becomes desirable because somebody else desires it. And to us looking at it, we say this is irrational. Why is that kid so mean? Little children are often uninhibited in expressing their desires. Us bigger kids often behave the same way, but we're better at disguising it. We're better at hiding it. Now, René Girard actually was born a Catholic and fell away from the faith, and then eventually, later in life, he began to take his his insights from ancient mythology and apply them also to novels and apply them also to the Bible. And you realize that the Bible actually is very aware of this triangular desire and how it causes rivalry and expulsion. And the story of Adam and Eve and the snake is a classic. So my picture is something like this. Adam and Eve are quite happy in the garden, no trouble at all, living there contentedly with God, chatting with him as God was wandering around in the evening breeze. And then along comes the serpent and points out to Eve the fruit. Classically, we regard it as an apple. And Eve says, now this is Jim Hynes' interpretation, you know, I never really noticed that until you pointed it out. And you're right, that really does look very attractive. So there's the triangle. There's the object, the fruit. There's the subject, Eve, and the model, who is the serpent. And because the serpent desires the fruit, then Eve picks up the desire from the serpent. Now the triangle is repeated because she has hold of the fruit, and then she offers it to her husband. And he says, funny thing, I never noticed that until you showed it to me. All of a sudden I want it as well. So Eve now becomes the model. Adam is the subject and the fruit is still the object. So why is this important? I think what it illustrates is how misdirected desire and desire which is often mediated by a third party is what causes so much trouble. A great deal has been built on this story in what we call original sin. The classic thinker for Christians was St. Augustine, and he described original sin almost like a sexually transmitted disease, that it was passed on to a child by their parents' sexual union through which they were conceived. So there's a sense it's passed on or inherited, but I would suggest the mechanism is much more social and psychological than biological or sexual. So the Ten Commandments seem to grasp this. And in fact, in Hebrew, the same word for desire of Adam and Eve and the fruit is the same word used, translated as covet. Do not covet your neighbor's wife or goods. So the Ten Commandments, the third set of them has this structure. The middle group saying, do not harm each other in these various ways. The first set against idolatry saying, from God, trust in me and don't trust in anyone else. And the third one saying, avoid misdirected desire because this is really going to drag you into trouble. And this, in fact, is very often the root of almost any sin. So what we're trying to get to is, what is idolatry and why is it something to be avoided? And it's not just a matter of jealousy, for example, of God saying, well, I get in a huff when you look at somebody else. And it's not at the level of Duke or UNC, you like dark blue, I like light blue. There's rivalry there, but in lots of ways over trivialities. So I would suggest that whatever is sinful in idolatry in ancient times is still sinful and damaging today. But the problem really is to determine exactly what idolatry could mean to us modern people. And I would suggest that idolatry still does exist in, for example, in scientific and also in religious enterprises. So this is what I mean. Idolatry really is the worship of the means towards fulfillment of the religious impulse as the fulfillment of the religious impulse. Another way of putting it is religious practices such as rituals or scriptures or reading religious literature as such are not really idolatrous unless they become the end or the purpose of the religious quest. They become, in fact, the object of worship rather than the means towards the fulfillment of the religious impulse. So idolatry, in a sense, is the loss of the sense of the search, the sense of the freshness of the experience. It is an over-quick fixing upon any method or device or concept as the ultimate fulfillment of the religious impulse. So idolatry, in a way, is allowing the impulse to be bribed by an incomplete but immediate satisfaction. So I'm going to give some examples which are bound to cause offense to some people. I would suggest that amongst biblical fundamentalists, the Bible itself has become something idolatrous. The Bible is the most important means towards knowledge of God. But too much emphasis on the Bible can actually become an end in itself, and therefore can be blocking us from a true knowledge of God. And amongst the Catholics too, we can have certain religious practices such as the Rosary, or devotion to Mary, or devotion to a particular saint, which are good in themselves. But if they become the end rather than means towards the further quest for God as God, they can become obstacles, they can become distractions, and to use this rather polemical word, they can also become idolatrous. So why, again, am I talking about this? Because the sin of idolatry can in fact be very costly to the person. It produces a kind of neurosis or fixity or rigidity or immaturity at sticking somebody at an immature level of development. It's a sort of arrested development at a way station, and usually for some small satisfaction that is to be had at that stage rather than pressing on into the mystery of God. Now, also in science, one can get some of this idolatry as well, where the idolatry is more about the scientific method. And you could call this methodolatry, when these methods themselves are valued or almost worshipped, rather than used for the objective to which they are directed. In this case, science has become idolatrous. And I'm sure that many people in our community are sort of immersed and based in this attitude, often without really understanding it, and it seems to have become a standard point of view to many people who practice the sciences. So as soon as either the scientist or the theologian, for that matter, allows themselves to be fixed upon an answer as though it were the ultimate fulfillment of their impulse, then they stop being really a scientist or a theologian and become an idolater. But I think that this problem is even more pressing in society and in economics. So in daily life, we continue to serve gods, every bit as transcendent and irrational and harsh as the pagan gods of old. So people sometimes say that our era has lost a sense of the holy, But I think it has really migrated somewhere else. It's not really in church any longer, but it belongs more to the state or to the market. Karl Marx has an expression, fetishism, which means more than people obsessing about material objects. It means that material things become enchanted and take on a life of their own. And in fact, as commodities begin to take on life, then life is drained away from actual people. So, for example, hungry people don't count in the market unless they have money to spend. And workers are often regarded as labor costs to be minimized rather than people with their rights and needs. So this commodification also hides the conditions of work. For example, if you go to the Amazon website and choose some desirable object and click on it and have it delivered here next day by Amazon Prime, you will see the commodity and you will see its price. But it takes a Herculean effort to uncover the people who actually made the product, even the people who delivered it, and the conditions in which they worked. Let's have a quick look at the history of advertising to see what I'm talking about. We can see how merchandise took flight from the material world and entered into the world of transcendence and the holy. So if you go back to the 19th century, if somebody was advertising, say, a pair of shoes, they would say, Mr. Jones' shop sells shoes. They're practical, they're affordable, they're comfortable. It's a shoe. As time went on, there was a shift away from stressing the use value of the shoe and towards a more intangible and even spiritual aspiration of the consumer for what the shoe may stand for. It may stand for freedom or sex or prestige or recognition or some other form of transcendence. A shoe might still appear in a shoe ad, but there would no longer be any mention of its utility. Indeed, there may not even be any mention of the shoe itself.